Good morning and welcome to Media in the Morning. I'm your host, Meredith, with my co-host, Matt Diskin.
It's very degrading when you call me co-host.
Well, it's degrading when life. So here we are for another episode. We're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to Matt's heart. Taylor Swift re-records Wildest Dreams in fresh copyright. Salvo is the headline from Bloomberg that we saw this morning. Matt's very excited, me too, about Taylor's newest re-recording of Wildest Dreams. I mean, I love Taylor, who doesn't? Listen to the two songs. I'm not sure I really heard much of a difference though. So Matt, what's going on? Why do we care?
Well, there's a lot of difference. She's much more mature as an artist now. I mean, you really see a lot more confidence in the way that she, presents herself. The crescendo is a little more bold. But we're not here for music critique. What we're here to talk about is how does this work legally? I mean, big, huge hit. Presumably, someone owns these rights. Taylor Swift's unhappy. She decides she's going to do it again, and she's allowed. I mean, I saw it was called Taylor's Version when I listened to it on repeat for a little while last night. How does this work? So what we've done is we brought in someone who really knows about this stuff, one of our colleagues and mentors and general sort of entertainment gurus here, David Steinberg, to help us out a bit. And so, David, could you just explain how does it work where someone signs a contract and then later, the main consideration for that contract being the song can be sort of taken away? How does that work?
Well, you have to think about a song really in two parts. One is the composition itself. And when I explain this, I usually use the Beatles as an example because they're a really good example to use. Lennon and McCartney, let's say, wrote a song, and that's them sitting around on pianos and guitars and writing the composition. And then the Beatles recorded it. That's John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And that's the master recording. So the two sides of the coin, whenever we're talking about a recorded piece of work, is the composition itself and then the recording of the composition. So what Taylor Swift has done here is she is re-recording, in other words, creating a new master recording of those compositions. And, anybody can record a composition as long as they pay a mechanical royalty and get a mechanical license. So using the Beatles example, anybody can record a Beatles song if they have a mechanical license. It might not come out very good, but anybody can do it. So what she's done is she's re-recorded her compositions and created new master recording versions of her original recordings.
So what happens though? I mean, how is that not a breach of contract with the people that she originally sold her recordings to? I mean, you'd think they'd put in a provision saying, we own this is ours. I mean, is that usual or does that vary? How does that go?
Really, you're talking about two things, and there's a little bit of a subtle distinction, but when you recreate a master recording, there's no copyright infringement. In other words, you can go and try and recreate a recording. There has been case law on this where they've said it's not a copyright infringement to recreate a recording, even if it's like almost bang on. In other words, there's artistry behind making this re-record very similar, almost identical to the original. That's a form of recording artistry and it's allowed. However, if, let's say, a third party was doing this and imitating Taylor Swift, that's a different story. Then you get into things like misappropriation of personality, etc., which is a big problem. But if it's the original recording artist doing this, they can pretty much get away with it and do it. But what you're talking about in terms of what might be in their contracts that would prohibit it, there's usually what we call a re-recording restriction in most record deals that will say, okay, listen, once you've recorded this song for us, we want to have some market protection. We don't want you running around and doing different versions that could compete with our version, the record company's version. So re-record restrictions are usually about 3 to 5 years, but sometimes they are more. You know, I've seen them be 10 years in some deals where I wasn't involved in the negotiation. I've seen them go 15 years. But the typical re-recording restriction is about 5 years.
So Taylor Swift, young Taylor Swift is finally sort of taking a back seat to older Taylor Swift, more mature Taylor Swift, as you said. And when we were researching this, we saw some other artists do this as well. And David, you had sent me an email about Def Leppard doing this and sort of the work that goes into getting the sound to be identical. And I think one of the artists in that was saying that he had to train his voice. So, you know, really speaks to the artistry that you're talking about. I guess, what happens next? Do you anticipate there's going to be sort of a trend towards tightening up those provisions around the re-recording license, especially when Taylor Swift so publicly does it? She's such a public figure. Do you think that this is going to sort of say...
Well, it's a brand dilution issue too, right? I think it's a brand dilution issue as well. So, yeah, I wonder...
What do you think is going to happen in the industry?
Interesting. I don't think it's traditionally been a huge problem for the industry. And when we talk about the industry, I'm talking about the industry side. In other words, it hasn't been a huge problem for record companies because in many cases, these re-records are of very, very old songs. So, you know, I think about the example of Kiss, who did this. They re-recorded a whole bunch of their hits. Randy Bachman and Fred Turner did it with their BTO hits. So these are songs that are going back, you know, 40 years plus. And I know that with the Bachman-Turner Overdrive example, they went back and used their original equipment. You know, Randy Bachman went and found the original amps he was using, the original guitars he was using. They sang, their voices are a little bit different now, but they're older guys. They're not going to sound the way they did when they were 27. But they tried their best, and there is some studio trickery that can help.
So, David, what's the difference between this and a reissue, like a re-recording versus a reissue? Can you just clarify that?
It would be a typical reissue would be where you take the original recordings and maybe you remaster them, you clean them up. Sometimes you even remix them. You know, you go back to the original recordings, you do a remix of it, clean it up, brighten up the overall sound, etc., and you reissue it.
So you have the rights then to the original master at that point.
That's right. And, you know, my personal favorites in that regard are Steven Wilson. He's a very talented progressive rock musician and producer. He's gotten the opportunity to remix classic progressive rock records, like Genesis Selling Them by the Pound, King Crimson Red, Jethro Tull's Aqualung. And basically what he's done is kept the original vibe, but just cleaned up these recordings and made them just, you know, much better. Because of the recording technology that's available nowadays. So that's the typical kind of reissue situation. Re-recording, I think one of the reasons that it hasn't created all that much of a problem for the industry is in many cases the re-record isn't good.
That's a legal term, right? Isn't good?
No, it stinks. You know? And you know, people listen to the re-record and they go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like the original. You know, I don't like that. You know, because people hear in their heads the original when they're listening to a re-record, I think. So if it's not up to snuff or it's not close enough, it bothers them. So I'll give you the perfect example of that. Back before you guys were born, there was a company called K-Tel. And K-Tel were notorious for putting out these compilation vinyl records back in the day when it was only vinyl. And what they would do is they would license from record companies single songs, and they put out compilations. And they might have as many as, 15 to 20 songs on one vinyl record, which of course lowered the quality. They were stuffing too much stuff on the vinyl. At a certain point, when the record companies stopped licensing these tracks to them, because they would do like the greatest 20 hits of the year, and they'd call their records, they'd give them names like, K-Tel Explosion, and they'd have all these.
The original mixtape.
And sometimes what they do is they edit the song. They'd edit to make it, sort of less in duration, to stuff more material on the vinyl. It was terrible. So you'd be listening to the song, all of a sudden it would fade out, and you go, wait a minute, it doesn't fade out there. And, they were doing this. Then what they started doing is going to these old classic rock, mostly Motown guys, and saying, hey, would you do a re-record of your classic hit? They would do the re-record, and it would be terrible. The person's voice would be, audibly different from what it was in 1964. They would use modern drums on the recording, and you go, what the hell is this? It doesn't sound right at all. So it was a bit of a cheat, well, a lot of a cheat, and the public usually didn't like it. They'd say, something's wrong, it's not the original, I don't like it. And when K-Tel would put out the records with the original recordings, they would say original recordings or original hits by original stars. If he said original hits, original stars, guess what? It was probably a re-record, and a bad one.
Taylor Swift, I listened to it. I don't think she fell into that trap. So
I think it's better.
Whoa.
I think it's much better. I do.
It's because you love her so much.
I'll be blogging about that later. And, David, I really appreciate you taking your time today to right now David's at an undisclosed studio with an undisclosed band. And so it's been something to get him out today to talk to us. So I'm really grateful for your time, Meredith, as always. My co-host Meredith and I are, we'll be back soon.
You're not bitter at all.
No, a little bitter, yeah. But we'll be back soon now with some new exciting content for you to binge with our new exciting internet property, Matt and Meredith Media Mornings.
See you next time. Denton's is a global legal practice providing client services worldwide through its member firms and affiliates. This episode is not designed to provide legal advice, and you should not take or refrain from taking action based on this content. Please see dentons.com for legal notices.